Okay, this is Dr. Annette Feravich, and we are here in the reading room, ready to get started. Started quite a bit later than we usually do, but nevertheless, we're started. Well, not yet, because I don't have my glasses. So, hold on, I don't think I put them in here. No. Okay, right back. If you weren't with us, which you should have been, darn it, in the DIY today, here's the Aldi's receipt for the things that we made. I know, got a lot of grease on it because we were cooking in the DIY. But you can see here that the chocolate bars were $1.99 and that the pecan halves were $3.49. So actually $5.50. No, 2 for $7.50. Pretty good deal. Ew, those are pretty dirty. I was cooking. I shouldn't cook in my glasses because that grease then splatters and it gets the coating on my glasses all screwed up. Okay. The Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Chiste Apocalyptus, or Chiste Apocalyptus. Not 4 weeks after the party, Dr. Abelard Louis Cabral was arrested by the secret police. The charge, slander and gross calumny against the person of the president. If the stories are to be believed, it all had to do with a joke. One afternoon, so the story goes, shortly after the fateful party, Abelard, who we had better reveal was a short-bearded, heavy-set man with surprising physical strength and curious, close-set eyes, drove into Santiago in his old Packard to buy a bureau for his wife and, of course, to see his mistress. He was still a mess, and those who saw him that day recall his disheveled appearance, his distraction. The bureau was successfully acquired and lashed haphazardly to the roof of the automobile. But before he could shoot over to Lydia's crib, Abelard was buttonholed by some buddies on the street and invited for a few drinks at Club Santiago. Who knows why he went? Maybe to try to keep up appearances or because every invitation felt like a life or death affair. That night at Club Santiago, he tried to shake off his sense of imminent doom by talking vigorously about history, medicine, Aristophanes, by getting very, very drunk. And when the night wound down, he asked the boys for assistance in relocating the bureau to the trunk of his Packard. He did not trust the valets, he explained, for they had stupid hands. The muchachos good-naturedly agreed, but while Abelard was fumbling with the keys to open the trunk, he stated loudly, "I hope there aren't any bodies in here." That he made the foregoing remark is not debated. Abelard conceded as much in his confession. This trunk joke in itself caused discomfort among the boys, who were all too aware of the shadow that the Packard automobile cast on Dominican history. It was the car in which Trujillo had, in his early years, terrorized his first 2 elections away from the Pueblo. During the hurricane of 1931, the Jefe's henchmen often drove their Packards to the bonfires where the volunteers were burning the dead, and out of their trunks they would pull out victims of the hurricane, in quotation marks, all of whom looked strangely dry and were often clutching opposition party materials. The wind, the henchmen would joke, drove a bullet straight through the head of this one. Har har. Just putting that up. It's no use. What followed is still to this day hotly disputed. There are those who swear on their mothers that when Abelard finally opened the trunk, he poked his head inside and said, "Nope, nobody's here." That is what Abelard himself claimed to have said. A poor joke, certainly, but not slander or gross calumny. In Abelard's version of the events, his friends laughed, the bureau was secured, and off he drove to his Santiago apartment where Lydia was waiting for him, 42 and still lovely and still worried shitless about his daughter. The court officers and their hidden witnesses, however, argued that something quite different happened, and when Dr. Abelard Luis Cabral opened the trunk of the Packard, he said, "Nope, nobody's here. Trujillo must have cleaned them out for me." End quote. Literally, it says end quote. In my humble opinion, it sounds like the most unlikely load of Jeringonza on this side of the Sierra Madre. But man's Jeringonza is another man's, but one man's Jeringonza is another man's life. The fall. He spent that night with Lydia. It had been a weird time for them. Not 10 days earlier, Lydia had announced that she was pregnant. "I'm going to have your son," she crowed happily. But 2 days later, the son proved to be a false alarm, probably just some indigestion. There was relief, like he needed anything else on his plate, and what if it had been another daughter? But also disappointment, for Abelard wouldn't have minded a little son, even if the Carajito would have been the child of a mistress and born in the darkest hour. He knew that Lydia had been wanting something for a long time now, something real that she could claim was theirs and theirs alone. She was forever telling him to leave his wife and move in with her, and while that might have been attractive indeed while they were together in Santiago, the possibility vanished as soon as he set foot back in his house and his two beautiful daughters rushed him. He was a predictable man and liked his predictable comforts, but Lydia never stopped trying to convince him in a low intensity way that love was love, and for that reason it should be obeyed. She pretended to be sanguine over the non-appearance of their son. "Why would I want to ruin these breasts?" she joked, but he could tell she was disheartened. He was too. For these last few days, Abelard had been having vague, troubled dreams full of children crying at night in his father's first house. Left a disquieting stain on his waking hours. Without really thinking about it, he'd not seen Lydia since that night the news turned bad, had gone out drinking in part, I believe, because he feared that the boy's non-birth might have broken them. But instead he felt for her the old desire, the one that nearly knocked him over. The first time they'd met at his cousin Amilcar's birthday, when they'd both been so slender and young and so jam-packed with possibilities. For once they did not talk about Trujillo. "Can you believe how long it's been?" he asked her in amazement during their last Saturday night tryst. "I can believe it," she said sadly, pulling at the flesh of her stomach. "We're clocks, Abelard, nothing more." Abelard shook his head. "We're more than that. We're marvels, mi amor." I wish I could stay in this moment. Wish I could extend Abelard's happy days, but it's impossible. The next week, 2 atomic eyes opened over civilian centers in Japan, and even though no one knew it yet, the world was then remade. Not 2 days after the atomic bombs scarred Japan forever, Socorro dreamed that the faceless man was standing over her husband's bed, and she could not scream, could not say anything. And then the next night she dreamed that he was standing over her children too. "I've been dreaming," she told her husband, but he waved his hands, dismissing. She began to watch the road in front of their home and burn candles in her room. In Santiago, Abelard is kissing Lydia's hands, and she is sighing with pleasure, for already we're heading for victory in the Pacific, and for 3 secret police officers in their shiny Chevrolet winding up the road to Abelard's house. Already it's the fall. Abelard in chains. To say it was the greatest shock in Abelard's life when officers from a secret police, it's too early for Sim, but we'll call them Sim anyway. placed him in cuffs, and led him to their car would not be an overstatement if it wasn't for the fact that Abelard was going to spend the next 9 years receiving one greatest shock of his life after another. Please, Abelard begged when he regained his tongue. I must leave my wife a note. Manuel will attend to it. Simeon, numero uno, explained, motioning to the largest of the Simeons. Sim is in capital letters, S-I-M, who was already glancing about the house. Abelard's last glimpse of the house was of Manuel rifling through his desk with a practiced carelessness. Abelard had always imagined the Sim to be filed with lowlifes and no reading reprobates, but the two officers who locked him in their car were in fact polite, less like sadistic torturers than vacuum cleaner salesmen. Simeon numero uno assured him en route that his difficulties were certain to be cleared up. We've seen these cases before, numero uno explained. Someone had spoken badly of you, but they will quickly be revealed for the liars they are. I should hope so, Abelard said, half indignant, half in terror. No te preocupes, said Simeon numero uno. The jefe is not in the business of imprisoning the innocent. Numero dos remained silent. His suit was very shabby, and both men, Abelard noticed, reeked of whiskey. He tried to remain calm. Fear, as Dune teaches us, is the mind killer, but he could not help himself. He saw his daughters and his wife raped over and over again. He saw his house on fire. If he hadn't emptied his bladder right before the pigs showed up, he would have peed himself right there. Abelard was driven very quickly to Santiago. Everyone he passed on the road made sure to look away at the sight of the VW bug. And taken to the Fortaleza San Luis. The sharp edge of his fear turned knife once they pulled inside the notorious place. Are you sure this is correct? Abelard was so frightened his voice quaked. Don't worry, Doctor, Numero Dos said. You are where you belong. He'd been silent so long, Abelard had almost forgotten that he could speak. Now it was Numero Dos who was smiling, and Numero Uno who focused his attention out the window. Once inside those stone walls, the polite Sim officers handed him over to a pair of not-so-polite guards who stripped him of his shoes, his wallet, his belt, his wedding band, and then sat him down in a cramped hot office to fill out some forms. There was a pervasive smell of ripe ass in the air. No officer appeared to explain the case. No one listened to his request. And when he began to raise his voice about his treatment, the guard typing the forms leaned forward and punched him in the face. As easily as you might reach over for a cigarette. The man was wearing a ring, and it tore up Abelard's lip, something awful. The pain was so sudden, his disbelief so enormous, that Abelard actually asked through clenched fingers, why? The guard rocked him again hard, carved a furrow in his forehead. This is how we answer questions around here, the guard said, matter-of-factly, bending down to be sure his form was properly aligned in his typewriter. Abelard began to sob, the blood spilling over between the fingers, which the typing guard just loved. He called in his friends from the other offices. Look at this one. Look at how much he likes to cry. Before Abelard knew what was happening, he was being shoved into a general holding cell that stank of malaria, sweat, and diarrhea, and was crammed with unseemly representatives of what Broca might have called the criminal class. The guards then proceeded to inform the other prisoners that Abelard was a homosexual and a communist. That is untrue, Abelard protested, but who was going to listen to a gay comunista? Over the next couple of hours, Abelard was harassed, lovely, and most of his clothes were stripped from him. One heavy-set Sibaiano even demanded his underwear, and when Abelard coughed them up, the man pulled them on over his pants. Son muy comodos, he announced to his friends. Abelard was forced to hunker naked near the shit pots. If he tried to crawl near the dry areas, the other prisoners would scream at him. Quédate ahí con la mierda, maricón. And this was how he had to sleep amidst urine, feces, and flies. And more than once, he was awakened by someone tickling his lips with a dried turd. Preoccupation with sanitation was not high among the Fortalezanos. The deviants didn't allow him to eat either, stealing his meager allotted portions 3 days straight. On the fourth day, a one-armed pickpocket took pity on him, and he was able to eat an entire banana without interruption, even tried to chew up the fibrous peel. He was so famished. Poor Abelard. It was also on day 4 that someone from the outside finally paid attention to him. Paid him attention. Late in the evening, when everybody else was asleep, a detachment of guards dragged him into a smaller, crudely lit cell. He was strapped down, not unkindly, to a table. From the moment he'd been grabbed, he'd not stopped speaking. "This is all a misunderstanding. Please, I come from a very respectable family. You have to communicate with my wife and my lawyers. They will be able to clear this up. I cannot believe that I've been treated so despicably. I demand that the officer in charge hear my complaint." He couldn't get the words out of his mouth fast enough. It wasn't until he noticed the electrical contraption that the guards were fiddling with in the corner that he fell quiet. Abelard stared at it with a terrible dread, and then, because he suffered from an insatiable urge to taxonomize, asked, "What in God's name do you call that?" "We call it the pulpo," one of the guards said. They spent all night showing him how it worked. It was 3 days before Socorro could track down her husband, and another 5 days before she received permission from the capital to visit. The visiting room where Socorro awaited her husband seemed to have been fashioned from a latrine. There was only one sputtering kerosene lamp, and it looked as though a number of people had taken mountainous shits in the corner. An intentional humiliation that was lost on Socorro. She was too overwrought to notice. After what felt like an hour, again another senora would have protested, but Socorro bore the shit smell and the darkness and the no chair stoically. Abelard was brought and handcuffed. He'd been given an undersized shirt and an undersized pair of pants. He was shuffling as though afraid that something in his hands or in his pockets might fall out. Only been inside a week, but already he looked frightful. His eyes were blackened, his hands and neck covered in bruises, and his torn lip had swollen monstrously. Was the color of the meat inside your eyes. The night before he had been interrogated by the guards, and they had beaten him mercilessly with leather truncheons. One of his testicles would be permanently shriveled from the blows. Poor Socorro. Here was a woman whose lifelong preoccupation had been calamity. Her mother was a mute. Her drunk father frittered away the family's middle-class patrimony, one terria at a time, until their holdings had been reduced to a shack and some chickens, and the old man was forced to work other people's land, condemned to a life of constant movement, poor health, and broken hands. It was said that Pa Socorro had never recovered from seeing his own father beaten to death by a neighbor who also happened to be a sergeant in the police. Socorro's childhood had been about missed meals and cousin clothes, about seeing her father 3-4 times a year, visits where he didn't talk to anybody, just lay in his room drunk. Socorro became an anxious muchacha. For a time she thinned her hair by pulling it. Was 17 when she caught Abelard's eye in a training hospital, but didn't start menstruating until a year after they were married. Even as an adult, Socorro was in the habit of waking up in the middle of the night in terror, convinced that the house was on fire, would rush from room to room expecting to be greeted by a carnival of flame. When Abelard read to her from his newspaper, she took special interest in earthquakes and fires and floods and cattle stampedes and the sinking of ships. She was the family's first catastrophist. She was a family's first catastrophist, would have made Cuvier proud. What had she been expecting while she fiddled with the buttons on her dress, while she shifted the purse on her shoulder and tried not to unbalance her Mary's hat? A mess, un toyo certainly, but not a husband looking nearly destroyed, who shuffled like an old man, whose eyes shone with the sort of fear that is not easily shed. It was worse than she, in all her apocalyptic fervor, had imagined. It was all worse than she, in her apocalyptic fervor, had imagined. It was the fall. That's a capital F, as in the fall from grace, as in Albert Camus, The Fall. When she placed her hands on Abelard, he began to cry very loudly, very shamefully. Tears streamed down his face as he tried to tell her all that had happened to him. It wasn't long after the visit that Socorro realized that she was pregnant with Abelard's third and final daughter. Zafa or Fuka? You tell me. Where are we on time? I don't know what time we started. Let me see here. I just want to see. It doesn't show me how much time. That's okay. I think I'm going to keep reading. Yeah. One more page. There would always be speculation. At the most basic level, did he say it? Did he not? Which is another way of asking, did he have a hand in his own destruction? Even the family was divided. La Inca adamant that her cousin had said nothing. It had all been a setup orchestrated by Abelard's enemies to strip the family of their wealth, their properties, and their businesses. Others were not so sure. He probably had said something that night at the club, and unfortunately for him, he'd been overheard by Jefe's agents. No elaborate plot, just drunken stupidity. As for the carnage that followed, que sé yo, just a lot of bad luck. Most of the folks you speak to prefer the story with a supernatural twist. They believe that not only did Trujillo want Abelard's daughter, but when he couldn't snatch her, out of spite, he put a fuku on the family's ass. Which is why all the terrible shit had happened. Which is why all the terrible shit that happened. So which was it, you ask? An accident, a conspiracy, or a fuku? The only answer I can give you is the least satisfying. You'll have to decide for yourself. What's certain is that nothing's certain. We are trawling in silences here. Trujillo and company didn't leave a paper trail. They didn't share their German contemporaries' lust for documentation. And it's not like the Fuku itself would leave a memoir or anything. The remaining Cabrals ain't much help either. On all matters related to Abelard's imprisonment and to the subsequent destruction of the clan, there is within the family a silence that stands monument to the generations, that sphinxes all attempt at narrative reconstruction. A whisper here and there, but nothing more. Which is to say, if you're looking for a full story, I don't have it. Oscar searched for it too in his last days, and it's not certain whether he found it either. Wow, what a good book. We are on page 244. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. Thank you so much for joining me here in the reading room. I haven't decided if I'm going to be here tomorrow. I'm not sure if I'm going to be here tomorrow or not. I don't know. It's Thanksgiving. If I'm not, happy Thanksgiving. I think I might be. I'm not sure. We'll see. I enjoy being here. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We've been here in the reading room reading the wonderful book by Junot Diaz called The Brief, Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. Thanks.